Hey guys, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth Through Ministry. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the Illuminati. I'm titling this video "A Conversation About the Illuminati." The past few months, I've been putting out a lot of content about giants and ancient archaeology in North America. I've talked about cryptids, talked about Sasquatch, a lot of those topics. And as I said in my video, The Future Reformed Truth and Ministry, that is going to be an emphasis of this ministry going forward. And that's going to continue to be the case. But I was preparing to do a video on angels because I think that ties in with a lot of that other stuff. But as I was just working the past few days and driving around, what have you, I just felt like the Lord was leading me in a different direction. And by the time I got to filming this video here at this point, I just got to the point where I thought it'd be good to maybe put angels on hold for whenever whenever I do that video in the future. And I decided that I wanted to instead kind of do a more kind of an on the cuff, off the cuff, just talking about the Illuminati, talking about what it is. I've made videos about this in the past. I've talked about the Illuminati before. I've talked about Masons. I've talked about the Jesuits and the Vatican quite a bit, almost ad nauseum, to the point where I felt like it's been good to take a break from that and focus on some other topics. And one of the reasons why I decided to kind of go in this direction is I've just observed a lot that there is such a great disparity between there are the people, whether it's in the Christian church or in American society in general, there's people that believe in, quote, the Illuminati or the New World Order conspiracy or a lot of these things going on in the world. And then there's this other group of people that they just think that it is completely crazy, completely nuts, that it's just, quote, a conspiracy theory. And there's just this huge chasm between these two groups of people, and that there's really no common ground. And I mean, that is what it is. That's not going to change. But for me, I think one of the reasons, there's a lot of reasons why that's the case, but I think one of the reasons is that in our society, we have just completely been removed from history. People don't know history as well as they should. And I'm not saying that in a condescending way. I'm not trying to blame anybody with that, but a lot of the history that's really really relevant has been removed from our schools. It's been a lot of good books have been taken out of circulation. They get harder to find. They're out of print. Even the internet, even since the 90s, the early 2000s, a wealth of information, so many sites, so much good information on so many topics has gone up. And now living in a day where free speech is going away in the West. So much is getting scrubbed. Now there's also a lot of really bad information on the internet, but that's what the information superhighway is. It's not supposed, I think people forget this when they're advocating for censorship. You're supposed to put the materials in front of everybody, and you have some assumption that people have enough common sense to be able to think through issues for themselves on some level. But we're moving in a direction in our society where we are, more and more people are believing that it's better to shut down voices and to eliminate, take away resources from people, instead of trusting that, generally speaking, people can think through issues from themselves. And we're really, the American experiment, the United States of America, it was really built on this belief in individualism, that that individuals have value, that they're smart, they're able to handle having personal liberty, they're able to being somewhat self-sufficient economically, not relying on the government for everything. But instead, our society, we're moving toward collectivism, and we're moving toward communism and globalism and totalitarianism. And it seems that when people question that, when people start to research, they find out the truth about history, what have you, those people, they're labeled as conspiracy theorists. And often the people saying that are the people who haven't looked into anything for themselves. So I just thought it'd be good to talk about this topic and to just give a little bit of overview of the progression of history of this topic, the Illuminati, because I just feel like it's important to try to just lay out some of this material to people and allow people to sift through it for themselves. So I'm going to be talking about kind of going back to 1776 by and large with the Bavarian Illuminati. I'm just going to talk about some of the historical events going up to our day. I'm going to talk about some books that have been written on this topic throughout the centuries, and just to give just a little bit of an introduction to this topic. Like I said, I've made a video on the Illuminati some years ago, a more structured, as it were, video, but this is going to be somewhat more of me just laying this out somewhat more informally, and I think that this is going to be helpful for people, at least for the people who are willing to look into it. And I want to start by, I'm going to read a passage of scripture. This is a passage of scripture I've read before, but it's a passage of scripture that I think is very important, and it's one that is very helpful for God's people. This is in Hosea chapter 4, verse 6. This even came up in my devotions the other day, and this got me thinking about some of these things I want to talk about today. But in Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, it says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt have no priest to me, seeing that thou hast forgotten the law of God, and I will forget thy children." So this is the principle that we're pulling out of this verse, in regards to, this is primarily in regards to the things of God, spiritual things, biblical realities, but this is also true about knowledge of the world in general, knowledge of various branches of learning, the sciences, history. The point here is that ignorance is not bliss, and that when God's people are ignorant of things that they should not be ignorant of, it is detrimental to them. And I think we're living in a time of very great deception in the United States or in the world as a whole. And I think that some people are able to see that, but many people quite literally have their heads in the sand and they don't want to see that. And I think that's really harmful to many people. So all anybody can do, all I can do is you try to lay out the material, you try to help people to see it, but I think we're living in a time where a lot of people, they don't want to see it. They don't, that these things that I'm going to talk about today, they're scary realities. It really confronts their more cozy view of the world, and people want to go work their jobs. They want to enjoy their pleasures where they can. They want to live the quote American dream, and they want to pursue, their pleasures, their materialism, and they don't want to be confronted by the reality that the world is a much stranger and darker place than they want to believe. And that's why you have this great chasm that I've talked about between a lot of people. So all that being said, I'm going to start by defining what is the Illuminati. Now this is a somewhat darker subject, but the Illuminati is an organization. It is one of the most powerful organizations in the world, and it controls a lot of different lower level subsidiary organizations, politically or secret societies or whatever it is. And that this organization really, it has the goal of creating what is called the New World Order, and that this organization wants to unite the world politically under a single government. They want to unite the world religiously under a single religion that will be essentially a Luciferian New Age religion and a cult religion. And they want to get rid of they want to get rid of the world's currencies and replace it with a single currency. They're moving us toward a cashless society. So they're uniting the world religiously, politically, economically, and they're really creating a totalitarian collectivist system. And that one of the great instruments that they've used to bring this about has been communism. I'm going to talk about communism a lot today in my video, because of the fact that when you hear the word communism, that's really the outer shell. That's really the front, and the Illuminati and the globalists, they're standing behind it. Now they've used other ideologies, like Nazism or National Socialism, and they've even in the capitalist countries with the banking system, they use a lot of different things. But communism has really been this big front that they've used to push these things upon the world, and that's essentially what the Illuminati is. And it has a number of very powerful families that are in it, and this has been true for centuries. Group families like the Rothschilds, or let me see here, the Rockefellers, the Bushes, the the JP Morgans, the Warburgs, the Cecil Rhodes, the Kennedys, these very rich and powerful families, the royal families of Europe have been involved in this at various times. And this is an organization that they have very powerful families that go way, 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 way back. And this conspiracy, they've been working on it for a long time. This conspiracy has been around quite literally for centuries. Now, many researchers who have researched the Illuminati, guys like Fritz Springmeier and others, they have said that at the very top there's this council of 13 families. I don't necessarily think that's wrong, but I really haven't been convinced, in my personal opinion, that there is a council of 13 at the top. Maybe that's true. I think, and for all of us who are on the outside, none of us really know. I think we know there's a hierarchy, we know there's a structure. But I think if we're being fair, most of us who are the people who have researched this from the outside, we don't really know all the bits and pieces of this at the very top. I believe Bible prophecy gives us the hints of understanding this. And I've said this in my other videos that I come at this from a historicist perspective. I really believe at the top of the pyramid is the Jesuits and Rome and the Vatican. And that is really what, not only what Bible prophecy, when you read Revelation 17, Revelation 18, this whore of Babylon, this city that rules over the kings of the earth, is the city sat upon seven mountains, the city of Rome. I think that's what Bible prophecy points us to. And I'm not going to talk about that in too much detail today because I've talked about that so much in my other videos. And I really do believe over the top of the Illuminati is the Jesuit order. And once again, I'm not going to talk about the Jesuits so much in this video just because once again I have talked about them quite a bit in other videos, and I probably will talk about them more in videos to come in the future. But for today, I want to stay kind of focused on, quote, the Illuminati, and just stay focused in that that realm. And I just want to walk through some of this history. Now, for most researchers, they understand that the start of this really goes back to May 1st, 1776, with Adam Weishaupt. But what a lot of people don't know is that the Illuminati even goes further back. Illuminism as an idea, as a concept, it really has been around for thousands of years, and it went back to ancient Babylon and to Egypt and what were called the ancient mystery schools. And then some of the Greek philosophers, guys like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, they went to these schools in Egypt and they got initiated into it. And we see it, I think, when you read Plato's Republic, this kind of utopian, almost proto communist society, you see kind of those ideas of Illuminism. And it went through various groups. It went through groups like Neoplatonism, and it went through the Gnostics, and it went eventually to groups like it went through the Islamic secret societies, the Druzes, the Fatimites, and then the Hashashin, the assassins. And then you get to the Crusades, and this idea of Illuminism, it found its way into the Knights Templar. And they have been a controversial group historically in their own right, and they eventually got suppressed by the Catholic Church in Europe. And then we see that those ideas went out to other groups eventually, like the Rosicrucians and the Masons and what have you. But when you get to the 1500s in Spain, you get this group called the Alumbrados, and it was kind of a Roman Catholic religious movement, a mystical movement. It had a huge emphasis on mysticism, but that it underneath it, it had these Gnostic undertones. And Gnosticism and Illuminism are essentially, they're very similar, corresponding ideas. And one of the guys who was a part of this movement was Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuit order. He founded the Society of Jesus, which we commonly call the Jesuits today. This is in the 1500s. The Society of Jesus officially got approved by Pope Paul III in 1540. So that's really the time frame we're thinking of. And before his society got officially approved by the Roman Catholic Church, he was actually arrested at one point by the Inquisition in Spain for being a part of the Alumbrados movement. And the Alumbrados, that word is the Spanish term for Illuminati. So we see that this goes farther back, and it's interesting. I don't have a copy of it in front of me. When you read the older editions of the Encyclopedia Britannica, in the English speaking world, this used to be far more common knowledge than it is. You read, say, the 9th, 10th, 11th editions of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and I've read that. I've read those articles. You can still find them posted online in, archives.com, whatever. This used to be far more common knowledge of the Illuminati and the Alumbrados in the English speaking world in countries like Great Britain, the United Kingdom, the United States. This history was not as suppressed as it is now in this day in history where we're living today. So you can go back, if you can find those older editions of the Encyclopedia Britannica, you can read about the Illuminati and how it goes back even farther back than 1776, even to the 1500s. And like I said, the idea of Illuminism goes even farther back. But when you get to Loyola, Ignatius Loyola, the Alumbrados, that's where I believe is the point in history where these ideas of Illuminism that passed through these various secret societies, it went more from this broad movement, these ideas, and they became a more concrete organization around the Jesuits. But then moving forward in history, then we get to 1776, and this is what most people understand as the founding of, quote, the modern Illuminati. And there was a professor at the University of Ingolstadt in Germany. His name was Adam Weishaupt, and he was the professor of canon law at University of Ingolstadt, which was a devout Jesuit Roman Catholic university. So once again, this shows the connections between the Illuminati and the Jesuits, like I've talked about before. And some researchers in this topic have claimed that Weishaupt left the Jesuits or that he became opposition to them. I don't think that that's really convincing. I think that there have been people who have had interest in trying to promote that narrative, but I don't think that he ever truly abandoned his allegiance to the Jesuits, to the Jesuit order. And he was a professor of canon law. That's Roman Catholic religious church law. That's what he taught at the University of Ingolstadt. He was a Jesuit priest, or at the very least, a Jesuit coadjutor. And for those of you who don't know, a coadjutor is someone who is not an official priest in the order, but is someone who is a lay person who is still, regardless, working for or serving the order. That's where his allegiances were. But anyway, in 1776, May 1st, 1776, which in the ancient pagan world and the occult world, that's kind of the spring equinox calendar date. It's often been celebrated across the world as May Day. And some people, if you've ever seen the old Cold War news footage in communist countries, they'd always have the May Day parade in Red Square in Moscow in the Soviet Union. And that's where you'd see the parade of the Russian tanks going through Red Square. Or they would have the trucks with the rockets on the back. They still do those type of parades in North Korea today, and you'll see the soldiers goose stepping. A lot of times in communist countries, they're celebrating May Day. The May Day parade is what it's called. And that many people believe that communist celebration of that holiday actually harkens back to the founding of the Illuminati. Now, people can debate that, but that's what researchers have talked about. But anyway, Adam Weishaupt, he was initiated into these things, and he came up with a plan he said he was going to use Freemasonry across the world, which this is the 1700s where Freemasonry is starting to become a large force in the world. It's becoming a secret society that's starting to grow and become prevalent in Europe. This is the time of the Enlightenment, of rationalism, of abandoning the old dogmatic beliefs of the church and of Christianity. People are becoming more open minded to new ideas, new learning. Some of those things, some parts of the Enlightenment were good, but many of them were very bad. Where a lot of this was a rejection of scripture, of Christianity, of Christ, of the Bible. A lot of this had been because of institutions like the Roman Catholic Church with the Inquisitions and their burning of anybody who was considered heretics. This had brought about a climate where people were now hungry for something different. They were hungry for more open-mindedness. This there's nothing new under the sun. We live in a very secular age where people don't like any form of dogmatism or rigidness in their beliefs. And some of that is right. That people can take that too far where you abandon all morality, all goodnesses, we live in a society today where we've made what is good evil and what is evil good. But a lot of that goes back to the Enlightenment, and that has been caused from a climate where Europe had been in the grip of especially Roman Catholicism for many centuries. And even many of the Protestant countries, when they came out, many of those countries established their own state churches. And in some ways, even though Protestantism was a step forward compared to the system of Roman Catholicism, many of those countries were still very rigid in their belief system. And that's what led to the Enlightenment. And Freemasonry came onto the scene in that climate of the Enlightenment in the 1700s. The United Grand Lodge of England, which is called the Mother Lodge of Freemasonry, it was officially founded in 1717. And then Freemasonry was becoming a large force, not only in the English lodges, but also on the continent in places like France and Germany. And so Adam Weishaupt saw this, and he knew that Freemasonry would be an instrument that he could use to fulfill his plan for uniting the world. He really did. Adam Weishaupt was the true Bond villain. And if you know what I'm talking about with, in the Bond novels and the movies, Blofeld, he's this conspiratorial mastermind. He's this evil genius who has this secret society in the shadows planning to take over the world. And Ian Fleming worked in British intelligence. He probably knew some things about the world that leaked its way into his novels. Art mimics life. And Ian Fleming probably knew what was going on because he had access to a lot of things working in British intelligence. But that's what Adam Weishaupt was. He's the original Bond villain. He quite literally came up with a plan to take over the world. He wanted to unite the world under one world religion, a satanic world religion. He wanted to unite the world under one government. He wanted to get rid of all class distinctions in society, including get rid of distinctions between men and women. He wanted to get rid of all class divisions between rich and poor. He wanted a completely egalitarian, what we would now call socialistic, communist like society, essentially what the type of society that George Orwell envisioned in his book 1984. That's essentially what Adam Weishaupt planned to do. And he planned to create this organization called the Illuminati, which he did. And he planned to use this organization to infiltrate into the Masonic lodges across Europe and across the world, even because it eventually came over to the United States as well. And he planned to use Masonry as an instrument to promote his plans of revolutions across the world, create wars across the world until he could bring about his desired utopian society as he envisioned it. And that's exactly what he did. He created this society. And this brings us up to really the first major world event that was influenced by the Bavarian Illuminati, was founded in 1776, was the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, when you really get into the history of the French Revolution, France was in a culture where the Bourbon monarchy had been corrupt and decadent and extravagant for a long time. And there was this major chasm between the rich and the poor. There was this very rich elite that was living in Paris, or they were going to the Bourbon court in Versailles, and they were living this rich, decadent life. And they were enjoying, I mean, Louis the 14th, this is before the French Revolution, he had created the Versailles Palace intentionally as a place of pleasure to distract his nobles, because he knew that his nobles were a threat to his power. He created this great absolute monarchy, and I don't mean great in a moral sense. I mean a great in a sense of just the amount of power that Louis the 14th had. And he said, I'm going to create Versailles, and it's going to be a distraction for my nobles, because they're going to be so caught up in this wonderland that they're going to not be focused on challenging my power. And he would say, then I can go and I can rule the country and I can focus on politics and war and power. And that this is going to be, kind of like the Matrix. It's a distraction for my nobles. And that continued on until the time of the French Revolution, where there was this very rich elite in Paris, and then you had the masses, the working classes, that were quite literally starving at various times in 18th century France. They didn't have any bread, I think it's a myth that Marie Antoinette said let them eat cake, because I don't think she actually said that, but that's the historical legend, is that the peasants were starving and they complained to the French government, to the monarchy, that they didn't have any bread, and that Marie Antoinette was, it's claimed that she said, well, let them eat cake. And the idea is that she was so removed from reality and so indifferent to their plight that she made this comment that really is just, because I mean, if someone actually made a comment like that, you would say, well, they're either they're clueless, they don't have a clue of what's going on, you're not reading the temperature of the room. But I don't think she actually said that, to be fair to her. But that's very much reflects what the culture of France was. And the Bavarian Illuminati, they saw that and they took advantage of it. And they created what was essentially the first communist revolution. Now, communism didn't officially come on the scene until Karl Marx later in the 19th century. I'm using the term communism anachronistically, but that's essentially what the French Revolution was, though. It is very much like the later communist revolutions, like the Russian Revolution or revolutions in other countries that came on the scene in the 19th and the 20th centuries, even though that term, communism, did not yet exist. And when you look at the leaders of France following the fall of the monarchy of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, people like Danton, George Danton, or Maximilian Robespierre, they were all Illuminized Freemasons. This is very well established history that these men were a part of French Masonry, and that the Illuminati used Freemasonry in France to cause the French Revolution. And that there's been people like the woman Nesta Webster, her book World Revolution, where she talks about this. And the front group that the Illuminati created were called the Jacobins, the Jacobin clubs, that they were political extremists and they were operating in France. And the influence of the Jacobins even found their way across the ocean to the United States. And even guys like George Washington were very concerned about the rise of, quote, Jacobinism or Jacobin principles in the United States. And this is the climate that France went into a state of true anarchy. It was chaos. France was not a good place to live during the French Revolution. It got to the point where the guillotines the guillotine, for people who don't know, it's the device where it comes down, it chops your head off. It's supposed to be it's actually was invented with the intention of it being a merciful death, because the idea was that if you're going to get your head chopped off, you want to have it done quickly and cleanly, and you don't I mean, the idea was that it would be such a quick death that it would actually be somewhat merciful, ironically enough. And when it works right, it's a quick death. But the idea that the point is that the guillotine became a symbol of fear and terror, because the killings in France were just relentless. It France went into just absolute chaos, and it culminated in the Reign of Terror. And it started off by, we're gonna kill the monarchy or the aristocrats or people that were loyal to the old regime. But whatever happened, but this is what happens whenever a bloodthirsty new government takes power. What the executions that were intended for a few spread to the many, and it ended up where people who really did not deserve to die were getting killed. It was, the distinctions were not really being made anymore. It just turned into this bloodbath, and it was a terrible time in history. And they really tried to dethrone Christianity, dethrone God. Now, France was a largely, essentially a predominant Roman Catholic society. There had been French Protestants in France, but they had been driven out by guys like Louis XIV. So, but these agitators, these revolutionaries, they weren't making distinctions between, quote, biblical Christianity and Roman Catholicism. To them, it's all just Christianity. And they literally dethroned the church, dethroned God in their society, and they literally came up with this goddess of reason, that reason was going to govern France. And it was actually very satanic, very occultic, the hatred and the venom against Christianity that came out of the French Revolution. They even tried to get rid of the 7-day work week, that biblical principle, 6 days you'll work, 1 day of rest. And they literally tried to create a 10-day week. You can read about how the French revolutionaries, they enthroned this goddess of reason, and they tried to completely get rid of Christianity. And for some years they barred They completely made churches illegal in France. It really was swinging the pendulum as hard as they could against anything associated with the old regime, the monarchy, the Roman Catholic Church. They were trying to get rid of all of it. And then eventually things got stable where the reign of terror came to an end, and there was there was a few different governments that took power in France, and eventually it led to Napoleon Bonaparte taking power, and then you have the Napoleonic Wars, and that went on. Now, after the Bavarian Illuminati got started in Bavaria, it eventually got suppressed, and it's kind of it's a very cinematic type movie type story where there was a courier who had letters from Weishaupt and the Illuminati. He actually got killed in this thunderstorm, and the authorities found these letters and they found out what the Illuminati was doing. And then it got suppressed in Bavaria where it had got founded. And even though it was still was active in other parts of Europe, it actually went underground in Bavaria, in the country that it got started in. And then obviously as the Illuminati started to work to promote this conspiracy, they tried to bring people into it, but then people started to try to expose it. One of the first books to really be written historically that to expose the modern Illuminati was this book here. Let's see if I can get it in front of the camera. There we go. This book is called Proofs of a Conspiracy, and the subtitle of it says Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All of the Religions and Governments of Europe, carried on in the secret meetings of Freemasons, Illuminati, and Reading Society. This book was written by a man named John Robinson. You can look this guy up. This is an interesting book that in the United States, there was a Protestant minister who actually mailed a copy of this book to George Washington. And George Washington even acknowledged that the Illuminati historically existed. I put some of that information in my own book that I wrote on this topic. But John Robinson was from Scotland. He was a Mason, a non-Illuminized Mason, because I think it's fair to say early on, I don't think Freemason was never good. I don't think you should have been in it, but it was never until the Illuminati really took it over. I don't think it started off as a completely, I mean, it was wicked, but it wasn't what it later became. So this man, the reason I'm saying that is this man, John Robinson, he was a Mason in Scotland, but he wasn't part of the quote Illuminati. That's what the history bears out. So he was a professor at the University of Edinburgh. So he was not what we would now today call a tinfoil hat wearing guy. He wasn't a paranoid guy living in a basement, what the movies portray. He wasn't this paranoid crackpot. That's not who he was. I mean, you'll see this with there's been a lot of very smart, intelligent, erudite men who have been in prominent academic positions in society over the centuries who write books about this topic because it comes to light. John Robinson wrote this book because he was approached about the Illuminati. He learned about what was going on and he saw it for what it was and he wanted to expose it, and he wrote this book. And this book has amazingly, even with all the censorship and whatever, it has survived to posterity. And this is one of the first books that was written on this topic. It's a very good book. If you're interested in going deeper, it's 18th century, it's readable. It's not a modern book, so you got to understand that, but it's very helpful. But that was really the first book that exposed what was going on. But now moving forward from the French Revolution into the 19th century, so Adam Weishaupt, he was alive until 1830. And then after him, the Illuminati really in Europe, the man who really took it over was a man by the name of Giuseppe Mazzini. And Mazzini was very famous for his part that he played in the Italian independence and unification movement. He was friends with Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was a Italian Freemason. He is really remembered as the hero who unified Italy, created this independent Italy. Garibaldi was connected to the Masons, and he was connected to Mazzini and most likely the Illuminati as well. And that Mazzini was friends with him. He believed he wanted a unified Italy. In his writings, he even advocated for a united Europe. And this is going back to the early 1800s when he was writing that. So that's looking about how Europe is progressing toward a united Europe, that the European Union, the European project, as it were, is moving closer and closer to a united unified Europe, that it's you look back, that it really goes back to Giuseppe Mazzini, and he really became really one of the great leaders in the Illuminati movement following Adam Weishaupt. And the other man in the United States who was moving in that direction, he was a leader in the Illuminati, was a man by the name of Albert Pike. And Albert Pike was the leader of the Scottish Rite, Southern jurisdiction of Freemasonry. He used to have, I don't know if the statue was pulled down. He used to have a statue in Washington, D.C. It might have been pulled down the past few years. But he is the Masonic Temple in Washington, D.C. That really pays homage to Albert Pike. Albert Pike was in the Civil War. He was a Confederate general, and he was in the Western Theater in charge of the Indian affairs, Indian allies fighting against the Union. And there was a lot of that history there. But at Albert Pike, he really became this leader in Freemasonry and in the Illuminati, and he was a Luciferian. You can find that in his book, Morals and Dogmas. That's a book that's been posted on the internet in more recent years. It's really historically the Freemasonry worked very hard to keep that book out of the hands of the uninitiated. But in the modern times we're living in, it's been possible to get access to that book, and he exalts Lucifer in the book, and Masonic apologists have tried to minimize that and say, oh, he's just kind of quoting that in a philosophical sense. It's not literal Satanism, but you're really getting into semantics as far as I'm concerned, where you're saying, oh, he's praising Lucifer in his writings, but it's not literal. I'm not buying it. But that's another thing. But yeah, but Mazzini and Pike, and they corresponded with each other in letters. They really became the leaders of the Illuminati. And the Illuminati, all throughout its history, it has always worked through creating essentially revolutions, unrest, and wars in Europe and across the world. And we see that one of the groups that was really connected to the Illuminati there was a group called the Carbonari, and they were operating in Italy and in France. And the Carbonari were, once again, they were these political revolutionaries, political extremists, political agitators. And that Mazzini really got initiated all this because he was a political activist. He got involved with the Carbonari, and then from there he really went deeper down. He got further initiated into these things. And then obviously the great thing that not the great thing, but the next big thing that the Illuminati did in part of moving forward their agenda is they created what we now know to be communism. They created socialism or communism, and Karl Marx, he was a Luciferian. He was a Satanist. He was raised in a Lutheran family. He came to reject all that. That's all been found in his writings, and he ended up founding, I believe, under the influence of the devil, that he founded what became essentially the most evil ideology, political ideology in the history of the world, and that's communism. Everywhere where communism has prevailed, it has been an extremely evil, totalitarian, wicked society. It is the ultimate magic beans. If you know the story of the magic beans, you promise these magic beans and they don't live up to what they're supposed to be. I don't know if you've ever seen the old movie, Mickey and the Beanstalk, where he thinks, oh, we're buying food, and it's a fugazi, and it's an illusion, it's a mirage. Communism promises everybody equality. It promises everybody fairness and equal shares of everything. And we live in a world where God does not intend for everybody to have equal property, equal possessions. It's just not the way the world works. And even when people have tried to make it that way, it doesn't work that way. Obviously, there's great inequalities in our world where there are people who are richer, there are people who are poorer, and the people at the top exploit the system. That's been going on all throughout history. But communism is a completely anti-biblical evil system because you really look at the 10 commandments, what God says about not thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's possessions. When you're going to take what communism does is, or socialism does, it says we're going to take all of your stuff, all your private property, and we're going to redistribute it, your possessions, amongst everybody equally. And it's not voluntary, it's mandatory. That's what communism is. And that's the promise that it promises everybody equality. But what always happens in every single situation is that it actually leads to the very opposite. You have a very powerful elite on the top ruling over everything, and they're very rich, and then everybody else is equally poor. That's what communism is. It promises one thing, but what it is in reality is something completely different. And the reason why people are attracted to communism, people are attracted to communism often because they see legitimate flaws in the system that they're living in. But then two, they have an ignorance of history or an ignorance of what communism is, and then it leads them to embrace it. We see this in the West today. People my age or even younger than me, people in their 20s, millennials, whatever, these college campuses have become leftist indoctrination centers. And people, they're advocating for socialism or communism as if this is a great thing. It's not a great thing, it's an evil thing. And I understand it's a tough old world out there. The system has gotten very unfair. The economy, the inflation is through the roof. It is hard to get started in this world as a young person. And sometimes I think the older generation they forget that I think the United States was far more prosperous some decades ago than it is now. That's a whole other tangent. But it has led, even though that is true to one sense or another, it has led these people, these younger people in these colleges, they're in universities, they have been completely deceived by this illusion of socialism and communism. And all of this really goes back to the Illuminati. I'm going to take a drink of water here. But moving forward here, I want to show another book here. I'm going to show a few different books as I go through this. So this is a great book. This is called Marx and Satan. This is by a Lutheran. He was a Lutheran minister by the name of Richard Wurmbrand. He wrote another book called Torture for Christ, which is a pretty moving book. He was in Romania behind the Iron Curtain under communism, faced persecution, even torture for Christ. Lutheran minister, but he wrote this book called Marx and Satan. As you can see, very small book, very easy to read. He documents these quotations from guys like Marx and Lenin, and he really shows that it's not as polemical of a book as you might think. It just documents these men's writings, and this book says that these guys quite literally in their writings exalted Satan or Lucifer or the devil. They'll use those names, sometimes Satan, sometimes Lucifer in their writings. But Marx and Satan, Karl Marx was initiated into the Illuminati. He had a relationship with Giuseppe Mazzini, even though some historians have tried to suppress that information. He had it. And then another man who he worked closely with was a man named Lionel de Rothschild, the Rothschild family. The Rothschilds have been uh, they've been a part of the Illuminati since its very earliest days, and they've been involved with the banking system and a lot of those other things. But Mazzini and Rothschild, they worked with Karl Marx to to create. Karl Marx wrote his book, The Communist Manifesto, in 1848. But then the first workers' association with socialism, with communism, it was called the First Internationale. And in 1864, that organization was founded. And from there, over time, communism and socialism, when Karl Marx died, it was not yet a very prominent ideology or institution. It had not yet really found its way into the mainstream of the world. But I got sorry. There we go. That book was slipping. But his ideology that he started, the seeds of that would grow, and it would move forward from there until it would become, over time. Now we're living at a time where socialism, communism is one of the most powerful ideologies in the whole world, and that's the times we're living in. And that all goes back to Mazzini, Lionel de Rothschild, Karl Marx, the first international, and the founding of communism. And then moving forward, still, really the next great historical event that really prompted this ideology to move forward was the Russian Revolution. And when you look at the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution that I talked about, there's very stark similarities between them. The Russian Revolution was actually two separate revolutions. There was the first revolution that put the Tsar the emperor of Russia was removed from power and a democratic government was installed in power. But then the power that brought Lenin to power, called the Bolshevik Revolution, is actually the second of those two revolutions. And then once Lenin came to power, and Lenin was once again, like Marx, he was a Satanist or a Luciferian, however you want to say that. He was initiated into the Illuminati. He was a part of this conspiracy, and he brought this to Russia. And after a very bloody civil war between 1917 and 1922, the Bolsheviks, or the communists, eventually won the civil war, and they came to power in Russia. And that was a huge step forward for this conspiracy, because now for the first time in history you have an entire country that has truly embraced communism in a way that it never has before. There were some governments before that where the seeds of it were there to one extent or another, but the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1917 to 1922 is the official start of the Soviet Union. 1921, 1922, at the end of the Russian Civil War. That's really this benchmark where you have this fully fledged socialist communist country, and from there it would spread across the world. And what most people don't know about this history is that there were very powerful globalists in the West that had worked to bring Lenin to power. People who were associated with the Illuminati, that they were moving this conspiracy forward. And there's a great book. There's two books here I want to talk about. This book is called now this is by a guy named Anthony Sutton. And he wrote a couple books. I got just a few of his books here. He says this book's called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. He talks about how very powerful globalists in the West, in the United States and in the United Kingdom and in Europe, people, the people who are the rich people on Wall Street, they helped bring about the rise of communism in Russia. They helped bring Lenin to power. And he also wrote another book. This book's called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. And in the people who brought the Bolsheviks to power in Russia are essentially the exact same people who brought Hitler to power in Germany. When you read those two books together, you realize that it's going to change the way you're going to view history. I think most of us, unless you get into some really radical neo-Nazi ideologies, almost everybody in the West knows that Nazism was evil. And then, I don't know, before the end of the Cold War in America, we used to know that communism was evil. But what most people don't realize is that those two ideologies that fought against each other in World War II, they're two sides of the same coin. Most people don't understand this. In Germany, Hitler was the National Socialist Workers' Party. Socialism, National Socialism. It's a Hegelian dialectical opposition to traditional socialism or communism or Marxism. And when you read Hitler's writings, and I'm not necessarily recommending it because he was a very evil man, but if you were to read it for the sake of historical scholarship, you would see that he advocates a form of socialism within the context of the Volk, the German people, the nation. He was saying that this is a different form of socialism from the historical Marxist form of socialism that took root in Russia with Lenin and them. In the Illuminati, these powerful people, they created both of them. They funneled money to both of these political movements. They raised them both up, and they crashed them together in World War II. And when you understand that, your view of World War II and history as a whole is going to change. This is what's called the Hegelian dialectic. You create a thesis, you create an antithesis. These two things that appear to be opposing each other, you slam them together, and then the result of that is you get a synthesis. And the idea is that through you do this over and over and over again, and then you move your agenda, your plan, your conspiracy forward. And this is what people in the Illuminati believe. They believe that out of chaos comes order. They like the occult creature called the phoenix is their symbol. And a lot of times when you look at these crests in history, like, people will say, oh, it's an eagle. A lot of times it's portraying a phoenix. And they believe that if we create enough chaos through wars and political revolutions, that out of the chaos of destroying the old order, there's going to be this new order, the new world order that's going to rise up. That's what the Illuminati does. And that they did that through creating the Russian Revolution, the rise of communism, and then they created Hitler and National Socialism, and then that really brings us forward to World War II. So that really is a lot of the history of the Illuminati up until 1945. And then I'm going to move forward into the Cold War in a second, but I want to back up and I want to talk about the history of the Illuminati. Another thing that happened was the creation of what have been called roundtable groups. Now, this is going back, I'm backtracking somewhat to the end of the 19th century, but into the beginning of the 20th century. There was a man by the name of Cecil Rhodes. When you read about the history of the British Empire and of South Africa, he was a very wealthy, very powerful man. He was a Mason, Freemason. He was part of the Illuminati. He was a very rich diamond baron, rich industrialist, and in South Africa. And he really helped create what was called the country that we now know to be South Africa. The Union of South Africa came about in 1910, and Cecil Rhodes worked very hard for that to happen. He wanted South Africa to be a part of the Greater British Empire. And Cecil Rhodes saw how powerful the British Empire had become by the 19th century, the 1800s, and he saw that he could use the expansion of the British Empire for the creation of this new world order. And he was very instrumental in starting what has been called the Roundtable groups. And in Britain, the group that got founded was called there was a group that got founded because Cecil Rhodes left his fortune for the creation of this essentially secret society, and it became known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs. But today it's called Chatham House. You can look up Chatham House on Google, and many of the politicians, a great number of the politicians, the prime ministers in the United Kingdom, even to this very day, they have connections to Chatham House. And then in the United States, the one that got founded was called um, the Council on Foreign Relations. So Cecil Rhodes was very instrumental in creating these roundtable groups. And after his death in the 20th century, other groups came about, like the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission. And these are essentially all subsidiary organizations to the greater, quote, Illuminati, which is at the very top. Now, I mentioned Anthony Sutton's books on the rise of Bolshevism, the rise of Hitler. Anthony Sutton was once again a very academic guy. He was a fellow at the Hoover Institute before his direction in his writings led him to have to leave that institution. But once again, just like John Robinson's proof is a comparison, another very smart, intelligent guy, not a crackpot, not a crazy guy. Then in regards to the roundtable groups, there was a guy by the name of Carroll Quigley. Here's this book. I'm showing all these books just to try to reinforce that this is real. This is history. This is reality. And I think when you see the book, there's just something to be said about it. It's just this stuff's been documented throughout history. Now, Carroll Quigley, he was allowed to get access to the archives of these societies, these roundtable groups. He was a professor at Georgetown. He wrote the book Tragedy and Hope. He talks about Cecil Rhodes creating these roundtable groups. He wrote another book called The Anglo-American Establishment, and he talks about these groups. So once again, this stuff has been very well documented. But then with these roundtable groups, going back to the Royal Institute of International Affairs, there was a man who was a leader in this group, apart from Cecil Rhodes, called Alfred Milner. Milner. And Milner was very instrumental in this group. And this is why the group has been called, it was called Milner's Kindergarten at one point, because he was really the leader of this movement after Cecil Rhodes. And this group, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Milner's Kindergarten, it had a huge influence at the end of World War One, of the signing of the Versailles Treaty. The British delegation that went there, and they worked very closely with the French delegation. The Allies won World War One. The United States, Britain, France, those are the main Allied powers that won the war against Germany. And Woodrow Wilson, he was very much influenced by these groups as well. And Woodrow Wilson, his 14 points, his plan for a lot of that was planting the seeds for the New World Order. And that what happened was that the signing of the Versailles Treaty, one of the things that was agitated for by these secret societies and by Woodrow Wilson was they wanted what was called the League of Nations to be formed. And this was really the predecessor to the United Nations. And the United Nations is probably the most famous globalist organization in the world today. It's just globalism, 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 bring everything together politically. Both the League of Nations and the United Nations, those were stepping stones to a world government. And the League of Nations got founded, and it really didn't have a lot of power, which is why, because it was created under the pretense of stopping wars, but it didn't really have much power, so it didn't really stop beginnings of World War II, and that's history. And it's interesting, in the United States, the Senate, the U.S. Senate, refused to ratify. It refused to become a part of the League of Nations because it saw it as an attack on American sovereignty. This shows how far we've come. Even just about 100 years ago, we understood that globalism, internationalism, the giving up of our nation's sovereignty, that's not a good thing, that's a bad thing. But we've moved so far away from that. But that's what these groups, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, or in our country, the Council on Foreign Relations, that's what these groups were advocating for. And then after World War II, now you get to the end of World War II. Once again, the Illuminati created that. You have the Bolsheviks in Russia. You have Hitler and the Nazis. And yes, of course, Hitler and the Nazis, they were evil. Hitler was heavily initiated into the occult. I'd say, even though I've said that about both communism and Nazism being evil, and that World War II, in a sense, was a controlled conflict, in a sense, there was a lot of people in our government and in the British government that were initiated in these groups too. It doesn't mean that the soldiers who fought in World War II didn't valiantly fight for freedom, because they did. Now, there's a lot of deception, obviously, but I don't think it changes the fact that those guys, those men that stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, or Guadalcanal, whatever, they did fight against evil totalitarian governments. I still see a lot of heroism in that, but there's a lot about what we've been taught about World War II that is just, it's really not accurate. But that's a whole other tangent. But when we get to the end of World War II, and then one of the guys pushing for the creation of the United States is FDR, the Roosevelt family. And FDR was a 33rd degree Freemasonry. He was a part of this. It's interesting that one of the men that he used that was very instrumental in getting the United Nations founded was Alger Hiss. And then when you get to the Red Scare in the 1950s, Alger Hiss was proven to be a communist. If you read about the Red Scare in the 1950s, where America was very concerned about communist infiltration of our country, I think history's proven that that was actually a very legitimate concern. Alger Hiss, one of the guys instrumental in founding the United Nations, he was working closely with FDR. He was a communist. It's just, once again, all these things, they come together. But this really brings us to the Cold War. Now, we've been taught that the Allies won World War II, and of course they did. But really, the greatest benefactors of World War II was not the Western countries. Yeah, they won, but the group that really was the most successful, that really gained the most from the end of World War II, is the communists, the Soviet Union. You look at the history, the Soviet Union conquered all of Eastern Europe. They suffered tremendously with the German invasion. German invasion went right to the gates of Moscow, right to Stalingrad. They went deep, they penetrated deep into the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union lost millions of soldiers to defeat the Nazis. But then the tide of the war turns. The Soviets, they come back and they go all the way to Berlin, and they pretty much devastated Eastern Europe. They pretty much looted, pillaged, and raped their way all the way across Eastern Europe, especially when they got into Germany. It was pretty brutal. The war on the Eastern Front in Germany was brutal. It was really brutal. But then by the time we get to 1945, though, they've conquered all of Eastern Europe, and all of the governments that they install in these countries, in places like Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary, they make sure that these communist governments that come to power, they're all essentially Soviet client states. They're satellite states. So the Soviet Union takes over half the world. And then only 4 years after the end of World War II, in 1949, the communists in China, Mao Zedong, he wins the civil war against the nationalists with Chiang Kai-shek. So the communists take over China, one of the largest and most populous countries in the world. So by the time you get to 1949, communism has taken over huge chunks of both Russia and Asia. And then obviously you get Korea is split between North and South, and then you get the Korean War, and then you get Vietnam. This is the start of the Cold War. The Cold War was really the communists were really on the offensive for the entirety of the Cold War. And the West, in a sense, fought gallantly to contain communism. You can read about that strategy of containment because the American government rightly believed that if communism spreads to one country, it will continue to spread to other countries. This was what was called the domino theory. And when you read about the Vietnam War, whatever, that this theory was promoted in the Kennedy administration or the Johnson administration in the 1960s. This idea of the domino theory, that once one government goes communist, it'll likely spread to other governments. And there was a lot of truth in that. I think there was, and that really the strategy of the United States in the Cold War was containment. We need to contain communism because communism at this point had become extremely powerful. And really, I think the West, in a sense, was doomed from the beginning. We've been taught that we won the Cold War. We didn't win the Cold War. We've essentially been losing the Cold War. And now communism and globalism and totalitarianism, most people don't realize that we're in the scene, the world scene right now is very, very dark. And I'm going to try to paint some context to that as I move along here. But when you get into the Cold War, like I said, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, North Korea, all of those countries are communist, North Vietnam, and the West fought very valiantly against communism. But you got to remember, the Illuminati, the globalists, a lot of them are in the West. The Western globalists and the communists in the East, they're two sides of the same coin. So there were people, I really do believe there were people in the American government or in the British government or in other Western governments that were true patriots. They loved their country. They were in the military or the intelligence services. When you get high up in the intelligence services, that gets kind of dark. But we're in the governments of these countries that really did hate communism. They were true patriots. They fought against it. But you're working in a system. You have people in high levels of power in your own government that are working against what you're fighting for. So you're fighting against communism. You're fighting against this stuff taking over your country. There are people in their own governments working against them. Even the communist infiltration of the United States, that goes all the way back to the 1930s. Even in FDR's administration, that there were high-level Soviet spies, even before World War II. Soviet infiltration, communist infiltration in the American government, it goes that far back. And then really when you get to the 1950s with the Red Scare, it really a lot of that infiltration started to come out. And yeah, there was some true hysteria with the Red Scare, but and I think McCarthy, you read about McCarthy with the Red Scare that I think did he get drunk with power? I think he probably did because that's the way it's portrayed historically that it was the way that it's taught in schools today is that the Red Scare was essentially just delusional hysteria and that the threat of communism wasn't very great. I think there was hysteria that broke out, but it was based on something that was a threat that was very real. And that's what we don't realize about the Cold War. And really communism really marched forward across the world. It happened in places like Africa and in Latin America, and we're really even living with that today. We saw in 1965, a good example of this, Rhodesia, they declared independence from Great Britain, what was called the UDI. And obviously Rhodesia and South Africa, they had their systems of apartheid, which I think there was things about apartheid that were very unfair to blacks in Africa. And I'm not advocating any type of racial inequality, talk about this history, but Rhodesia fought a long war against communist guerrillas called the Bush War. The prime minister of Rhodesia was a man by the name of Ian Smith. And whatever you think about Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe, you got to understand that those men in Africa were essentially on the front lines of fighting against communism. That's exactly what happened. And they realized that if they gave up their control of their country to these terrorists, these guerrillas, that their nation was going to be completely destroyed. And that's exactly what happened because the Western governments like Great Britain and the United States, instead of helping South Africa and Rhodesia to fight against communism, in Africa, they betrayed these countries and gave them over to the terrorist guerrilla. So in 1980, you get the creation of Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe, who was a Jesuit trained communist terrorist, and he essentially drove out or killed off all of the white farmers in Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. It was the breadbasket of Africa, and it was able to feed its own population. And this country had a very high standard of living. Now, granted, there were economic inequalities between the whites and the blacks. I've acknowledged that, but this country was essentially almost like a first world country. And today, it's become, instead of being the breadbasket of Africa like it was, it essentially, because all the white farmers were driven off their land, all the land was redistributed because of communism. It's that nation has essentially been starving, and that's why Robert Mugabe was a terrorist. He was a thug, quite literally a thug, and he was a murderer, and he was a dictator, and he eventually got driven out of power by people in his own political party because the fact that he was such a menace. Now, obviously, the government there is the same political party as Mugabe, so where things are. And then you come to South Africa, 1994, and South Africa, it fought against communism in multiple places in Africa. You read about the war in Angola, where South Africa was fighting a war against communism in Angola throughout the night from I think it starts in 1979 and goes throughout the 1980s. And at the communists, not only the Russians but the Cubans were sending thousands of soldiers to fight in Angola to spread communism in Africa. And that so South Africa was the most powerful country in Africa, in the southern continent, in that portion of the world. It was the most powerful of the more Western English speaking nations. And it was this bulwark against communism. And yeah, were there inequalities with apartheid? Yes, I believe there were, like I said. But like this history has been portrayed in a way where we don't realize that South Africa was essentially an ally of Western Europe and the United States in this fight against communism. And when Nelson Mandela came to power, he's portrayed as one of the great heroes of the 20th century. His political party, the ANC, was backed by the South African Communist Party. It was in its own right a communist party. It's come to power, and it's in that government taking power was essentially a communist takeover of South Africa. That is the history of South Africa that most people don't want to acknowledge. And that whatever South Africa's flaws were, it doesn't change the fact that it was a Western government fighting against communist terrorists, and that's essentially what happened. And what's happened in Africa is also happening in Latin America. And the strategy was for the communists based in Moscow or the globalists across the world is let's pick these countries off one by one. We're going to pick them off so that countries like the United States was the most powerful Western anti-communist country. We're going to leave it in the place in the world where it's isolated and all its allies are gone. And that's essentially where we're at right now. The United States, the remaining conservative bastion in the United States, which is drying up by the day. It's essentially gone. There's very little left of it. But that kind of that Christian, conservative, Bible believing, believing in liberty, anti-communist bastion in the United States is discovering that it has very few friends in the world. And if you're anti-globalist, if you're anti-communist, if you're quote Christian or conservative, you realize you're very isolated. And that was the strategy throughout the Cold War period. Because once again, Rhodesia went down, South Africa went down, communists spread all throughout that portion of Africa. And the same things happened in Latin America. In 1959, you have the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro comes to power, backed by the Soviet Union, and then you have all the history with the Bay of Pigs, 1961. You got the Cuban Missile Crisis, all that history that's with Cuba. But then in countries all across South America, you've had the promotion of communism. And a good example of that would be in 1980s, 1989, the communist government, the Sandinista government, took power in Nicaragua. Well, that's just one country. And then in more modern times, you have in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, socialist, communist. He was good friends with Fidel Castro, Venezuela. That's another example. And then when you really get into the governments of like Peru or Brazil, whether they explicitly call themselves communism or not, socialism has had an extremely large influence in Latin America. And this is because Latin America, many of the people there have been very poor. These are considered third world countries. So the appeal, once again, the appeal of communism has a very large effect. And this is what this stuff has been going on for decades. And most average Americans, they don't want to face these realities that communism is spread throughout the world. But then the other part of this, so this countries like in Africa or countries in South America, communism is spread. And now we're getting to the point where it's also spread so much in the United States and in Western Europe because there's been the promotion of what is called cultural Marxism. And cultural Marxism, this goes back to Antonio Gramsci, where it said they realized that the West was so strong politically and economically that yeah, they would use violent revolutions where they could in places like Africa or Latin America, but they said to bring down the West and get it away from capitalism and move it toward communism. They said we're gonna destroy the traditional morals of the West. We're gonna promote immorality. We're gonna move it away from Christianity. We're gonna move the West away from its traditional values, and we're gonna promote sexual immorality, things like pornography, fornication, all of the various left-leaning social movements in the West. That all goes back to cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism has been one of the most successful ideological movements of the 20th and early 21st century. It's had an extreme effect. And like I said earlier, it's been promoted in our universities and our colleges, and that we have an entire generation of people that have been brainwashed with this communist cultural Marxist rhetoric. And all of that goes back once again to the Illuminati and the globalists and their agenda for the world. And there's a lot of people that will be willing, there's a lot of Christians or conservatives that they'll talk about communism to one extent or another. They'll even use terms like the globalism of the deep state, but they don't want to take that step deeper. They don't want to see that this agenda goes back hundreds of years. And a lot of this history I've talked about the Illuminati, they don't even want to hear about it. But a big part of the communist plan for the West, they said that one of the things they promoted was that they wanted to lure the West into a false sense of security, and they promoted really the end of the Cold War was a fugazi, and really there were a number of high-ranking communist defectors who came over here and they tried to warn the West. Men like Anatoly Golitsyn or Jan Segna from Czechoslovakia or Yuri Bezmenov. Some of his videos have been promoted on the internet. He got interviewed by uh, Griffin. I'm forgetting his first name. Griffin. He was associated with the John Birch Society. But anyway, yeah, Anatoly Golitsyn, of all the defectors that came over and tried to warn the West, he was probably one of the highest ranking communist defectors in history. He was a major in the KGB. He was high enough up that he knew what they were writing, and he went into hiding. When someone's a defector from communism and they're on the book circuit, that means they're a fake defector. Real defectors go into hiding because they're under threat of their lives being ended by people who want to kill them. That's what Anatoly Golitsyn did. He essentially went into hiding to preserve his life. But he wrote a number of books, and they got preserved in posterity. He wrote a book called New Lies for Old. And this started out essentially as a CIA memo. The man who debriefed, who came over and accepted Anatoly Golitsyn's testimony, was the head of counterintelligence for the CIA named James Jesus Angleton. And James Jesus Angleton, he has a controversial history in his own right. He has connections to the deep state and the shady underbelly of the CIA and all that. There's a lot of history there, but he believed in Anatoly Golitsyn was the real deal. And he did correctly believe that there were moles, Russian moles in the American government, and that there were moles, Soviet moles working deep penetration. And history has tried to portray that as that they tried to say that James Jesus Angleton just got that his paranoia working in the world of intelligence got the better of him, and that the later part of his career he futilely was searching for these moles, and that history's tried to portray him as that the later part of his career was dampened by the fact that he let his paranoia get the better of him. That's false history. That's no, I don't think he didn't succeed to the extent that he wanted to in discovering the extent of Soviet and communist infiltration of the United States. But he was correct in understanding that that infiltration was going on. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't hysterical. He knew what was going on. Anatoly Golitsyn was telling the truth. Some people have tried to say that revisionist historians have worked hard to either lessen or even fully discredit his testimony to history. That's that's baloney. And he wrote another book called The Perestroika Deception. This is a fascinating book, absolutely fascinating book, The Perestroika Deception, where he said communism is going to fake the end of the Cold War. They're going to fake the fall of communism. This is exactly what happened. And they're going to do this intentionally to lure the West into a false sense of security, because the KGB and the Soviet Union realized that communism as an ideology made further strides more quickly when in these periods where the United States guard was down. What history we call these periods détente in the 1960s, or no, I'm sorry, the 1970s. Nixon, he pursued a policy of détente with the Soviet Union under Brezhnev, and that term has been kind of anachronistically applied to any periods where there was kind of a thaw in the Cold War, where there were more peaceable relations between the West and the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union realized in those detente like periods that that was when communism made the most advances. So they realized that if they could get the West into a permanent state like that, that their infiltration would advance further than there ever had. And once again, like I said, communism is the face of the Illuminati. It's the front for promoting this totalitarian new world order. And that's what they did. And in the book, The Perestroika Deception, I just showed you, Anatoly Golitsyn even said they may even try to pull down the Berlin Wall, which is exactly what happened. People have done. He wrote that book. He made a number of predictions, over like 120 predictions. Over 90% of them came to be true. And you got to remember, this guy wasn't trying to speak prophetically. It's not like Bible prophecy where you need to be right 100% of the time. He was writing this as an analyst, analytically. So if you have over 90% of your predictions coming right, you're not trying to predict the future in a prophetic sense. You're just saying, based on my analysis, my research, this is what's going to happen. I would say over 90% of your predictions is pretty accurate. That's pretty good. And that's exactly what happened, because Anatoly Golitsyn, he was the great defector. And guys like Yuri Bezmenov, if you can find his videos on the internet, he said essentially the same thing. That he said that the purpose of the KGB is not intelligence gathering. Yeah, it does that, but its primary purpose is to fight against the West through what he called psychological warfare. That you try to pull down, you try to create instability in a country, you try to demoralize that country, and then you pull out their traditional views, and then you replace it with communism. And so Yuri Bezmenov in his own way was saying the exact same things that Anatoly Golitsyn was. And then that man, the defector Jan Segna that I mentioned, he was from Czechoslovakia. He wrote a book called We Will Bury You, making the exact same type of predictions. There's a whole list of these defectors that came from communist countries. They tried to warn us, and there have been very few people who heard their warnings to us. That their warnings have fallen on deaf ears, and that's why we are living in the state we are. We're watching free speech in the West just vanish away. We're being swept up in this communist, totalitarian, globalist spin, because we think, oh, we won the Cold War in 1991. The Soviet Union broke up in 1991. The Berlin Wall came down, I think, 1989. So we think we won. And what they were doing is that infiltration, and that communism never went away in Russia. Behind the scenes, it is still exactly what it was in Eastern Europe. But the thing is, communism has also made tremendous strides in in Western Europe and places like the United Kingdom and here in the United States. And we are living in an age where there are very few bastions of resistance left to this communist plot. And when we get into modern times, I've already been talking for an hour and 20 minutes, so try to wrap things up here. But I mean, you get into things like, I mean, 2020 and 2021, I think woke a lot of people up in the United States what was going on. And if you talk about certain things that went on during those years, you get deplatformed. So you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I mean, we're living in times where we have, people have learned about the 2030 agenda, the Great Reset. The Great Reset, that's communist terminology for what's been called the eternal Bolshevik Revolution, the workers of the world uniting, the global communist revolution. That's what the Great Reset is. It's just the 2030 agenda. You're going to own nothing and be happy. Guys like Klaus Schwab advocating the fourth industrial revolution. These guys who are promoting these agendas, they've literally said, you're going to own nothing and be happy. We're going to live in pods. We're going to live in government housing. We're going to be eating bugs and we're going to be happy. I'm not exaggerating. This is the type of rhetoric these guys have been putting out. This is the same agenda, the New World Order agenda. And they've been very, very successful in moving from one country to the next, taking over the world. And biblical Christianity has really become a remnant of what it was. The state of the church, that could be a whole other video. And it's a video maybe I should do at some point. But there's very few voices left that are speaking out against this. And if you talk about these type of things I've talked about in this video, you are going to be labeled as a conspiracy theorist. You're going to be considered a nut. It doesn't matter how calm and rational you speak. It doesn't matter how much research you've done, how many books that you've read. It doesn't matter because you don't fit the narrative that they want to push. So you have to be silenced. And that's what's going on. And it's ironic. People have tried to speak out against this conspiracy, but they have been silenced. I think JFK was trying to warn us in his own way before his assassination. If you read the speech that he gave at American University, where he said, "We are being opposed around the world by a ruthless and monolithic conspiracy," and he went in detail to say how it's using primarily covert means. I'm paraphrasing this. Covert means to achieve its ends. It's operating in secret from the shadows. He was saying that it employs political, military, economic, and social avenues. And I think JFK was warning us. Now, some people have said, well, he was just talking about communism. He wasn't talking about a conspiracy in the West. Now, I think that can be debated, but based on what I've said, that's kind of semantics anyway. He saw a threat to freedom. Now, I don't. It's. I think Kennedy. Him and his family. They were part of it. So I don't know what. Did he have some type while he was in office? Did something wrangle his heart for him to speak out? I don't know. We'll probably never know what went in his thought process because when he got put in the office, he was not supposed to be opposition. That's what I believe, and I think what happened is maybe I mean it's human beings. Even when you're initiated into evil stuff, sometimes your conscience just gets the better of you. So maybe he just something inside and moved him. You read about Kennedy; he was a very flawed man. He was sleeping with other women. He cheated on his wife. I mean, obviously, he was very different from the very because he was very popular during his presidency. He was very much presented as the all-American guy, and Jackie Kennedy was beloved as this wonderful first lady, but he was behind the scenes a very flawed man. But I think something moved him to speak out, and he did, and he got killed not long after that speech. Kennedy assassination, that's a whole other topic, but and even like got filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick, his last film before he died, Eyes Wide Shut. And I'm not advocating watching it. It's a wicked movie, but just as a historical footnote, I need to mention this. He makes this very Kubrick. He makes this very dark movie about it stars Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, and it's talking about this sexual underworld essentially, and then but you get to the end of the movie and Kubrick portrays this occult ritual, and it's interesting in real life that ritual that's filmed in this mansion was filmed in a real Rothschild mansion. And Kubrick, he was an insider. He got invited to some of those high level parties. And I think that he was trying to expose it. And then obviously the studios that put the movie out, they pulled about 20 minutes out of the film. So as much as got shown to the public, a lot of it got pulled out. And then, that movie released, many people consider it his worst film. It got very little promotion from the Hollywood studios, and then he died not long after that. Once again, I think Kubrick, in his way, he was trying to expose it using media. Like I said, I'm not trying to promote the movie, but it's a historical footnote. This is what happened. This is another voice that spoke out. And I could give examples. There's been a lot of people, when you get into people who claim to have come out of the Illuminati, and some people I do believe have been genuine defectors, it's very, very hard to verify their claims. It gets very difficult. So there's a lot more that could be set up on this. But yeah, but these people, these are very powerful people. They're highly motivated by their agenda. They work very hard to promote it. These are the rich and powerful people of the world. And they really are at the top. They really are worshiping and serving the devil. That's what it is. I mean, and that's what those occult rituals are. And things go on that are very, very bad. They're unspeakable. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but you have a group of people at the very top who are serving the devil. They're trying to take over the world. Quite literally, they're trying to take over the world. And they essentially, to a large extent, rule the world, but they're trying to take it to that next level to promote their new world order, and they are quite literally trying to kill us or enslave us. And that's what's going on. And this is where I want to end my video on: is how should Christians, especially, or just not even, or just people in general, how should we respond to that? If you get to the point where you finally get your head out of the sand and you're willing to face reality, it's a difficult reality. I understand it is. But you get to the point where you finally realize, like, wow, this is happening. This is real. How should we respond to that? And I think it should quite literally strike the fear of God into us. Because that's a very scary reality. Now, I don't think we aren't supposed to be petrified by fear. We're not, I mean, the Bible says time and time again, do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. But that's a scary reality. If there's a group of people working to do that, and these are the people who are in power in this world, that's a very scary reality. And you know what that should lead us to do? That should lead us to want to get on our knees and pray and get right with God. We should be thinking about our souls, ultimate, because whatever happens to us on this world, we are eternal beings, and we're living in a spiritual world that's been created by God. And this all goes back to this spiritual war that's been going on between God and Satan ever since the beginning. That's the reality of what's going on. It's a reality that a lot of us don't want to face. We don't want to face the fact that we're going to be held accountable of God, and we do need to flee from our sins. We need to and seek the Lord's face. That's what we need to do. Now, ultimately, we can only be saved by the grace of God, but these realities should truly strike the fear of God into us, and it should lead us to examine the state of our souls with God. Because with the way the world's going, the only protection we have is the Lord. That's the reality. That is the truth. And that's the truth we need to hear. There's a lot of people that believe in this stuff, these quote conspiracies. They believe a lot of things about the world that are true, but they are not right with God. They don't know Christ, and they need to know the good news of the gospel. They need to know that Christ has come to this world to die for his people, and that all who believe in Jesus Christ shall not perish but have everlasting life. That's the message that everybody needs to hear. And this should lead us to get right with God. I think when you connect the dots, you go, when you read history, completely unrelated to the Bible, you're just reading and studying history, and you read about this stuff, and you go, okay, the Illuminati's real. And you go, okay, at the very top, these people quite literally are serving Lucifer. They're quite literally serving the devil. And you go, wait a minute, how on earth can you explain that apart from a biblical paradigm? Now, people have tried to do it. Non-Christians, they've tried to say, well, that doesn't necessarily prove the Bible is true. And I would technically agree, it doesn't. But man, that would be the coincidences of all coincidences, that the Bible says that the devil is the greatest enemy of humanity, and he's the origin of this rebellion against God, and that he's been a conspirator and a liar and a murderer from the very beginning. and then you find out that the rich and powerful people of this world are quite literally serving that exact same entity that the Bible talks about, that would be, if the Bible wasn't true, that would be the greatest coincidence in the history of coincidences. It would be. And when you come to that reality that all of that is real, I think the only conclusion you can come to is that the scripture is right. Christianity is the only paradigm that explains this level of evil, because the Bible, to believe in these type of realities, these quote conspiracies, you have to believe that people are not inherently good. You cannot believe that people are inherently good. You have to believe that people are inherently sinful. And I think when you see the world as it really is, where people are trying to do that, you understand that, wow, the devil's real, sin is real, and the Bible is the book that explains all of that. It is the only book that explains all of that, and that's just the reality that we are living in. So all that being said, guys, I'm gonna stop here, but I really do hope that this has been a helpful video. I know it went pretty long, about an hour and a half today. I knew it was going to be a little bit longer, but I hope that this has been a good snapshot of history, kind of laying out all this stuff. I would encourage people, like I said, ultimately, if you do not know Christ, my ultimate encouragement would be get a Bible. I'd recommend the King James Bible. I know that's a whole other issue. Get a Bible, read your Bible, and start praying, start seeking the Lord's face. That is my encouragement. And the other thing that I would say is, apart from that, people, you need to, obviously you don't want to let these things consume you to the point where you're truly paranoid, but it's not a sin to study and to know what's going on in the world, to research. If you do that with wisdom and with grace, being dependent on God, ignorant, as I said in the beginning of the video, ignorance is not bliss. The church is, with not with this issue, but with the whole host of issues, the church has got its head so far in the sand. A lot of these guys in leadership, they're hirelings. They're just worried about people coming in, hearing their feel good therapeutic messages. We've turned Jesus into a life coach, and they want people to come in, pay their tithes, pay pay their salaries, and they just don't want anybody to ask any questions. And the church, which the church should be at the tip of the spear against fighting against evil, the church, the professing church, is often the place where people who are trying to blow the horn of alarm, trying to wake people up and warn people, the church is usually the place that is suppressing those people as much as any other institution. I'm not going to say the most, but to the same extent as all the other institutions of the world, it's no different. So we need to study. We need to wake up. We need to see what's really going on, and we need to study and know the world. So if this stuff is as much as I covered in this video, I covered about this much. I could have talking for another 3 hours. That's why I wrote. That's why I wrote this book here, which is literally, believe it or not, this book's like 500-600. This book's about 600 pages long. And what people don't realize, this book could have been twice as long. I had to cut a lot out, but this book is trying to take all this type of stuff. This is my book, The Hidden Enemies, The Antichrist, The New World Order, and the True History of the World. And the reason why I wrote this book is because after what happened in 2020, 2021, I felt like it was a time where it was a time to confront this stuff head on. And some people have really liked this book. I've gotten good feedback. There's some people that weren't very happy with me that I wrote it. That's so true. But we need it. We need to face reality, and we just can't. We can't just ignore this stuff. And guys, I'm not saying this just to try to sell books. Yeah, I would, if you this is a good resource. I would hope that people would be willing, if you want a book that tries to just put it all together. I wrote that book so that people could get it all in one place, as it were, without having to read the stack of books this high. That's the goal of that book. And then in the back of the book I wrote, I got an appendix with all the other books like the books I talk about. So if people want to, they can go and do the more research and do all that. Because I know that not everybody's going to read 30 books. So you try to put it all in one place. That's why I wrote my book. But the purpose of me saying this isn't just to sell books. There's a lot of great books. Read books. There's still, even with all the censorship on the internet, there's still good videos on the internet. There's still good websites. Read Christian books too. Read stuff on theology. Read your Bible. I could go on, but like we just need to study. We need to wake up. I know not everybody's going to be a scholar. They're not going to write PhD papers on this type of stuff, but we really ignorance is that's what that is my encouragement for this video, guys. Ignorance is not bliss. So I hope this has been a helpful introduction to some of this history with the Illuminati, with globalism, with communism. A lot of this stuff I talked about, it could have been an hour-long video in its own right, but I hope this has been helpful. But as I always say, guys, don't take my word for it. I encourage you to study, look into these things, research, think through it for yourselves. Think for yourself. We're in a society where we're being trained to not think for ourselves. They're pushing us into this collectivist mold where we're not supposed to think for ourselves. We're supposed to just believe what we're told. Don't take my word for this stuff. Think for yourself. Ultimately, the greatest standard of truth is going to be the scripture. So I take these things as the word of God. Be Bereans. And if you do that, God's going to bless it. He's going to give you greater wisdom and greater discernment. With all that being said, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth Through Ministries. God bless, guys.
If you enjoyed this video, then check out Joe Harper's books. Ordering information available at www.reformedtruther.com.